record here for future generations. Welcome to Office Hours. This is August 8th, 2017. I'm Ryan. This is my last Office Hours hosting, and I have a pleasure tonight of introducing the next Office Hours host, Chris Martin. So welcome, Chris, and really excited to have this chat and to get you started off on Office Hours. So we have a number of students that have joined, and as always, we'll have a chat about analytics, but please, anyone feel free to chime in at any point. You will have many future Office Hours to talk with Chris and ask his opinions about things. But what might be interesting tonight is to find out kind of what his areas of expertise are, what his experience is, so that you can bring these questions to future Office Hours. So without further ado, without I guess any more intro from me, Chris, can you tell us maybe a little bit about yourself and especially how and why you got into analytics?
Sure. So I sort of took a winding path. Right now, I do mostly marketing analytics, business analytics, data science-y type stuff, variety. I'm at Shutterfly right now, and my focus is on design of experiments. So marketing channel lift experiments. And then before that, worked in a couple of ad tech oriented companies, and that all came after an MBA. Before that, I worked as an epidemiologist. So I was doing statistics on diseases, and that was fascinating. I got into that just out of sheer interest. It was always fascinating work, and I loved sort of being sort of a data detective. And along the way, I picked up a comfort doing data analysis, a little bit about statistics, so that was a really fun. It was a fun job, but I kind of felt like I wanted to broaden my horizons and get away from working that close to the government, and so I went to business school and got an MBA.
Fantastic. And can you tell us a little bit about maybe the work you're doing now or the work you've done recently and kind of what parts of maybe the curriculum ties to or it highlights or what you'd say maybe your areas of expertise are?
Sure. So right now I'm focused on experimental design. And so which is fun because it's, as you peel back the onion on how exactly you're going to test something, there's a lot you have to think through and be explicit about. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of flexing a muscle I hadn't used since like undergrad when I did ecology experiments. Before this, at Chartboost, I was very much a generalist. So I worked on all manner of things related to Chartboost's business model. Mm-hmm. So, a big challenge for Chartboost as a mobile game cross-promotion platform was market making. So optimally matching supply to demand. That's their chief business goal is get the app publishers, get them advertising, and the advertisers help them find users when they advertise efficiently. So a lot of it was around, coming up with creative metrics and diving into what we saw in terms of fill rate or ability of advertisers to spend their budgets, try to identify pockets of inefficiency, just where is there a mismatch? There's demand but no supply or vice versa. Mm-hmm. That drew on a lot. I guess statistically, it wasn't really hardcore statistics so much as it was just working with data and making sure we're framing the business question well. And in some cases, coming up with expedient ways of measuring things that would otherwise be really hard to measure. A lot of examples of we want to know some quantity. Is it possible to, measure, to find some other thing that's a lot easier to measure and tells us maybe 90% of the answer? Again, drawing on experience from Lyft, is matching supply and demand can be really hard, and while it seems like it should be a problem ripe for convex optimization, it's really not in the real world. And sometimes getting little wins is a lot bigger than going for the big wins. So that was the strength of analytics over data science, even in a company that's
that's doing really explicit stuff like that. So, the experimentation is really an interesting topic because it's, oftentimes if folks ask me about different, what are the maybe top 3 principles in analytics, it's a really important one. At the same time, it brushes up with a lot of the curriculum of this course, but doesn't necessarily intersect at different points. So would love to hear a little bit more from you in general about experimentation, and maybe we can walk through kind of in theory like what the process looks like for you when you're trying to design an experiment, or what the frameworks that you've set up, some of the principles that you follow, and then we can dive into some of the details. But at a high level for you, what does an experiment look like? When do you identify when to use an experiment to figure something out? And what does it look like for you?
Sure. That's a really good question. I guess so. A lot of our role is anybody in business analytics is going to play this role a lot for something of an internal consultant. So you know data analysis, but somebody else knows the system that you're working on a little better. So a lot of it, it's kind of like a consulting engagement. There's a lot of questions around, I guess the starting point for any, I think, experimental analysis is what's the decision we're trying to make? Mm-hmm. Like figure out a business decision and be real clear on that, because you can always have like a rough idea. Get that explicit. Like what really would you do? What are you, deciding among, and figure out what information you need to make that decision. And narrow that down. Once you've got a decision that you're driving, think about, the causal pathway that you're looking at. If it's advertising, really say what you think the ads are doing, so that you make sure that if you set up the experiment in a certain way, it actually is addressing what you think the ads are doing, as opposed to setting up the experiment, getting to the end, and then having somebody raise the question of, well, that's not really how we expect the ads to work. So what you found doesn't necessarily.
Yeah.
You want to talk about the causal pathway, and then, from that point, you develop a hypothesis and you make that explicit into a statistical hypothesis. And at that point, you get to dive into the joy of power calculation. And a power calculation is it's more than just the math. It's really, it answers a lot of questions. The most important being, should we actually do this test? And that question, the answer to that depends in large part on, do we have a fighting chance at finding the effect that we think is operating there? Mm-hmm. If it's going to be too small to discern an effect that is really there, then you shouldn't do the test. And this comes up in medical research too. So for instance, if you're enrolling subjects in a trial where there's some risk to the subjects, there's always some, but the trial, and you think that, a vaccine treatment works, but the effect size is, pretty small. You want to discern the effect. You want to prove your case. So you enroll people, you subject them to some risk. If you know that the trial is too small to discern that effect, with statistical significance, it's unethical to do the test. You can't justify putting people at risk if you don't have a reasonable chance of seeing the effect. Yeah. So the power calculation logic sort of follows that general framework, and a lot of what goes into it requires background estimates, guesstimates, best guesses of what, the number, how many people you have, what's the size of the effect, and what do you expect the variance in the measure to be. So that's the unsexy statistical side of it. And then at that point, you try to get as much hay in the barn as possible in terms of planning and contingency planning, get your interpretation of the results written down ahead of time. And fill out your results table ahead of time. You can populate it with fake data even, because that really forces you to think, oh, are we going to see that? Or, that can't happen. It can't be iOS or Android if somebody's buying something from their desktop computer. Does that make sense? So you iterate through and you make sure you know exactly what you're going to get at the end. You queue up your interpretation depending on what it is. And then at that point, there should be very little marginal work through to the end of the study. You get the results, you take the veil off, you look at who got the placebo, who got the medicine, and you do the statistical test that you agreed on. And then at that point you stop like this is real important, is you get the answer to the question you decided to ask, and then you stop. You don't want to keep doing sub-analyses or indulging additional curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody's got additional curiosity and sub-analyses you want to do. The trouble is, if you don't have a hard ending point for an iteration, you're not really iterating. You're not really moving on and doing another iteration of something if it just sort of bleeds into the next. So it's kind of a bit of discipline that we adhered to.
Interesting.
So that's sort of the.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. So we could break down it. One question that sort of pops out to me at the end is, this is something I talked with Josie about. So I'm putting my former words on the line here. Is, how do you feel about tracking one metric versus multiple metrics? And then, if you do choose to track multiple metrics, how do you deal with the kind of multiple hypothesis problem there? What's the important things to keep in mind?
Yeah, it all rolls back up to the decision. Mm-hmm. A lot of the thing where you'll have, we saw, the number of players went up, but the average revenue per game player went up, so what does it really mean? A lot of that can be, you want to try and head off as much of that tail end discussion as you can by really identifying what's the business decision up front, and then what information do you need. And if you can say up front that you would not do anything differently based on the average revenue per user or the retention that you see or whatever, then, maybe leave it out of the test. It's not that it's not nice to know, but, or put it in the test, but be real explicit about how you're going to turn it. So it's a lot of thought discipline up front that has to happen. Otherwise, I tend to ask around, because there will be people who differ, and they're I'm just one opinion, but there's a risk in having too many results and allowing that to sort of distract the focus from the piece of information you were really after, because you had money you needed to spend and you wanted to know where to spend it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you feel comfortable sharing with us maybe an example of an experiment, with real humans and a real decision at some point in the past that, maybe it went ideally or sub-ideally, and what it looked like?
Sure. It'll have to be something that I'll probably just talk about a public health example, because that's
great.
All done and published. But let's see. This was a long time ago, but it was a study of a microfinance intervention for HIV incidents in South Africa, and it was the intervention that they were. So the outcome measure that they cared about was HIV incidents. We directly measured that.
Wow.
In folks in the area where we're testing, and the intervention that they used, the experiment was of a microfinance intervention. So the idea is going small scale loans coupled with a program of education, and they had 8 communities, and they randomly the design of the study was, given 8 communities or 4 pairs of similar communities, you take the 4 pairs and then randomly allocate one community to be the treatment group that got the intervention, and one community and the other community did not. So it wasn't just 4 and 4. There were 4 pairs, and just so it was sort of like a block randomized design would be, I guess, a statistical term. Beforehand, they measured HIV prevalence among folks, de-identified, of course, and then to get a baseline, and they did a questionnaire to find out a lot of ancillary information. The study, they measured the same people who were uniquely identified by a non-identifying number, in a way that you could get to the actual identity of the person, of course. All of us passed ethical review boards. And there was a standardized statistical metric of incidence rate difference between the 2 groups. And the execution of that test, it raises a lot of questions. Did the test have sufficient power? Power calculation for a matched pairs trial is a little tricky. Even though there were 10,000 people, or at least 3,000 for whom we measured HIV status, the power calculation was based on the number of communities. So so the power of the test, depending on the assumptions, was it left things open to argument about was the power. Now, obviously, it passed ethical review, so it there's a statistical case for this case study to be powered well enough. But you start to see one thing I remember was just in the execution of these tests, like taking care of the saliva samples, the custody chain between our team in the field and the lab that was testing them. There were making sure that there was an ironclad handoff there. And it seems kind of mundane to lock this stuff down, but there's a lot of attention given around just the really mundane pieces like that. And that kind of colors a lot of the questions I ask now if we're doing a test.
Sure.
I often ask, like, how are you sure that that's going to happen? Like, what is the where are you going to put the file? How are they going to know when it's updated? Little things like that don't seem very sophisticated, and it's literally just out of habit of seeing like things, not necessarily. It just sort of Murphy's Law. That execution.
Yeah. Some of my like data analytics mentors have said that good analyst knows the data. Sort of like we've heard the farm to table analytics. You need to know where it's grown. You need to know how it's transported. You need to know how it's processed, how it's cooked, and then how it's served. So
that's a great term. I hadn't heard of that, but that is a great term.
Yeah, you can take it. That's a really interesting example with that. I almost hate to ask this question, but a lot of, I think, what I've seen at Lyft and other places are folks that don't necessarily have a stats background will want to like do an A/B test or do like maybe an A/B test light, just compare two metrics without statistics, or try to use an online A/B test calculator that like estimates variance or something. What are your words of warning / caveats for that sentiment?
Sure. It's a lot of it's. So, I mean, the watchword is reproducibility. It's I'm a little bit afraid of online calculators simply because you can't see the code. It's really preferable to, if you're using Excel, whatever you're doing, make it reproducible so that somebody can go back and see exactly what you did, including yourself. Post hoc, because honestly, it's likely that somebody will make a mistake at some point in the process. As long as you can see that, as long as you can step back and say, "Oh, here's where we need to do things differently," then I mean that's I think you're in a good place. I think the danger is in not doing work that's reproducible and auditable, and otherwise, I wouldn't really necessarily. Yeah, I mean, I think that should be the watchword, and that applies to folks who have PhDs in statistics as well as people who are who don't have any statistics background. It's just important in both cases, and that the costs of not being reproducible are just as important.
Yeah, no, that's good. One question I should have probably asked at the beginning, but am now kind of getting back to is, what's the benefit of doing an experiment versus just trying to use like past historical data and clean some of the maybe one-off events out of it. For example, we had someone that was thinking about, well, they're trying to introduce different product lines, figure out the effect of cannibalization. They're like, well, we've introduced product lines in the past. Can I just clean out some of the effects and study that? Do I really need to go forward with an experiment? What are your thoughts, in general on that?
That's a good question. I think there's with a controlled, with an interventional study, it's possible to make a lot of mistakes, but you get the benefit of designing the specific intervention you want, and you can kind of to the extent that you can, you curate stuff around answering the specific question that you have, as opposed to, maybe a tangential answer to a tangential, or an answer to a tangential question, which may be, pretty informative, but, you can zero in on exactly what you need to do to drive a decision with an experiment. You can, under assumptions of randomization, you can do away with, questions of confounding, by randomizing your unit of observation, which is great. I mean, that's gold standard for a reason. On the other hand, it can be more costly. Well, let me get you the benefits. A final benefit is it can help you crystallize your thinking. So if there's more cost to doing an experiment, that's a forcing function to think through exactly the decision you're driving and what information you want to go hunt down and get. You're not going to just, if it costs you a lot of money to get information, you're not going to say, well, just give me all the information we can get. So it's a forcing function to crystallize your thinking around the business decision and what you need. The costs obviously are, a lot of times it's easier to look at data you've already got. And, that's what a lot of analysis work is. It's looking at what's already happened, and it drives decisions. It's useful. One cost of using historical data is biases can creep in based on, so biases about what you actually see. Like if you're measuring looking at average deployment length, I mean, you're only looking at, people that return from deployment and have like a record in the system. That's from, military public health. So, and also just an analog to finance, for example, is when people are talking about historical returns of the Dow Jones Industrial Average or, any stock index, well, there's survivorship bias there. So the companies that went out of business are not incorporated into that, 7% annualized return over the last 100 years. So when you're looking at data you already have, you do have to be careful about accounting for the biases that are inherent in that data getting to where you can look at it. But, both useful, both have costs and benefits. But yeah.
That's great. So with a few minutes left, I wanted to see if any of the students that have joined us have questions. Again, I guess there's no shortage of time to ask Chris questions. We'll be here every week from here on out. But I wanted to make sure that if anyone has a burning question, perhaps about Chris's location, since I've already been asked that question tonight. I want to also stress that, tonight we've really been focused on experimentation because I think we've needed a really good session on that. It's something I think I wanted to do, and Chris has an expert on that, but of course he has experience with a lot of different things. So, future office hours will deal with many different topics. But I guess as a second to last question, what are the kind of like tools, technologies, or frameworks that you found useful in setting up, analyzing, using experiments?
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. And maybe as a secondary part of the question, the tools that you use to match up, your supply versus demand, the problems you did there.
Yeah. I guess for data analysis, I tend to use R a lot, and that's I like R for business analytics because it's got I use the R IDE, R Studio, and otherwise R it's an open source language, so you can treat it as such. Let's see, what else? SQL, obviously. I rely heavily on GitHub for checking all my code, and Amazon S3 or Google Cloud Storage, just any like sort of cloud storage tool where you can put stable links to things so that you can come back to them later. The difference there is between that and like Google Docs, where you put a Google Doc up there and who knows who's gonna go in and muck around with it.
Sure. Well, if you leave the link open for anyone to view, you might have an anonymous hippopotamus.
Exactly. So
rhinoceros.
Yes. Exactly. They will Yeah, so there's risk there. So I like to kind of avoid Google Docs. But those are the so R, SQL,
Sure.
GitHub, and Amazon, and Excel a whole lot,
Mm-hmm.
obviously. And Excel's great. It's sort of the universal language of doing business analysis. It's something most people have access to. So being comfortable with Excel and being able to build something in Excel that you're comfortable handing off to someone else as that's understandable is a huge skill to have and develop and continually hone.
Awesome. Yeah. So one last question. What can we expect to see or hear in future office hours? I know you've done a lot of exciting work with your students and local data, and obviously there's experimental. Worked with many different companies. What should we expect to hear?
Sure. I think I'll obviously, I want to take cues from the audience if there's stuff they want to talk about, and obviously have it be a good session for students to ask their questions and socialize what they're doing more, and make sure that other students can see in general people are working on the same stuff, have the similar challenges, etc. From my side, I like to try and find interesting things here and there that are related to data science and business analysis generally. There's usually something that catches my eye once a week that I think office hours would be a good venue to talk about and get folks' opinions on.
Excellent. Chris Martin, everyone, and be hosting office hours in the future. So thanks for joining us tonight, Chris. And to the folks, most of who I've recognized here, and Joe's obviously created, Brittany, Mario. It's been wonderful to do office hours with you for the last year. So thanks for joining, thanks for talking, and I'm excited for you to move it forward.
Excellent. Good luck in business school, Ryan.
Thank you.
That's so much fun. You're gonna love it.
Yeah, hopefully so. Yeah, well, very exciting. Great. Well, we'll see everyone later.
Okay.
Take care.
See you next week, guys.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.